So, good morning again to everyone. I'm Alicia Melton, and today I'm going to talk about, my segment is Today in Black History. Each week I talk about Black American achievement or a historical event. So, today I'm going to talk about the 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment is when African Americans received citizenship. And so, in my reading, I'm going to talk about laws that led to the 14th Amendment. So, that would, we're going to talk about Reconstruction, a little bit about Reconstruction, and Black codes. And so, uh, good morning, Destiny Affairs, Affair, and good morning, Tito. For you, again, I'll be talking about the 14th Amendment. All right. So, like I said, if you want to add any information, something that that you think about, what you know about the 14th Amendment, just go ahead and post it in the comments section. All right. Okay. So on today, July 28th, 1868, Secretary of State William Seward issued a proclamation certifying without reservation that the 14th Amendment was a part of the United States Constitution. The required number of states had ratified the 14th Amendment a few weeks earlier on July 9, 1868. So on this day, there was like this public announcement, a public official announcement about the 14th Amendment that it had passed. Okay. So this amendment is known as one of the Reconstruction amendments, along with the 13th and the 15th Amendments, which we'll talk about as well. These were known as the Reconstruction Amendments because they were the first enacted right after the Civil War, and all addressed questions related to the legal and political status of African Americans. The 14th Amendment forbid any state to deny any person life, liberty, or property without due process of law, or to deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So this amendment again granted citizenship to African Americans. All right. So during this time, political leaders of the North and South faced many difficult questions during Reconstruction. And Reconstruction took place between 1865 and 1877. So right after the right after the Civil War. All right. So they faced difficult questions. For example, what rights should be granted to approximately 4 million free people? How should these rights be protected? How should the South be rebuilt? How should the 11 states that had succeeded or withdrawn from the Union be readmitted? All right. So after the Civil War, our first amendment that was passed was the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. So this is where we are right now, and that was in 1865. So Andrew Johnson, so the 13th Amendment abolished slavery, and I'll read this. It was passed in Congress January 31st, 1865, ratified December 6, 1865. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. So the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. So now we get to, we move on to Andrew Johnson, who became the president after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. Under his Reconstruction plan, he allowed Southern state governments to pass a series of laws called the Black Codes. These laws regulated the activities of freedmen in the southern United States after the American Civil War. Some Black codes prohibited owning land or carrying firearms. Others established a nightly curfew or permitted authorities to jail them for being jobless. Many Southern whites joined or supported terror campaigns against African Americans attempting to vote, run for public office, or simply claim other basic civil rights. In 1865 and 1866, thousands of African Americans were murdered in the South. They lived in poverty. Many were forced into living and labor arrangements that strongly resembled slavery. So with the Black Codes, which I'm going to go into details, was being forced upon African Americans because of these Southern states still opposing them being free, that they were trying to put in law something that was still similar to slavery so that they can still have control. All right. So I'm going to talk about, I'm still talking about Black codes, but I'm going to talk about Florida Black codes. Because Florida was one of the states that did withdraw from the Union. But before I start reading about that, I just have a trivia question as it relates to Florida. Who can tell me what year did Florida become a part of the United States? Or become a part of the Union? Who can tell me what year did Florida, what year did we, I'm in Florida, and those of you who are in Florida, what year did we become? And if you know the full date, that's good too. I'll just give a few seconds for that answer. Okay, no one knows. All right, so I'll give the answer. So March 3rd, 1845 is when Florida became a part of the United States. And actually, it was the 27th state that became a part of the United States. All right, so I'm going to move on to the Florida Black Codes. And I got this information. Let me just cite the source. So I got this information from the Florida Historical Quarterly, and the article is titled Florida Black Codes. Okay. The reaction of a majority of white Floridians to emancipation was disapproval. In August 1865, the Gainesville New Era reported, "There are quite a number of persons seem to hope that the next Congress will reestablish slavery. These codes regulated the lives of Black people, dealing with civil rights, labor contracts, vagrancy, apprenticeships, courts, crimes, and punishments. Many planters hoped to keep the freedmen on the plantation in some form of servitude. The desire for unpaid or poorly paid labor was a major reason for the enactment of the Black Codes. They believed that rigid controls were essential to force them to work. They were given no political rights. They were permitted to testify only in cases involving other Black people, and even then the jury was to be white. They were forbidden to carry firearms of any kind. Special punishments for work was also created. When the laws called for fine and imprisonment, there were super added the alternative of 39 lashes, standing in the pillory, or both. Vagrants could be arrested and sentenced to as much as 12 months of labor. If a freeman entered into a contract and was disrespectful to his employer or refused to work, he could be sentenced for vagrancy. Children of vagrants were at the disposal of the county as apprentices. A man was sold for 40 days for taking a drifting log out of the water and selling it. They were assessed large fines for petty offenses. In Lake City, 2 African American men were convicted of stealing 2 boxes of goods from a railroad company and were fined $500. When they could not pay, they were sold to the highest bidder. A few months later, a white man was convicted of an unprovoked murder of an African American man. He was fined $225 and sentenced 1 minute imprisonment. In Mariana, a white man was convicted of assaulting an African American man and fined 5 cents. African Americans were severely punished by the courts, but when acts of violence and injustice were imposed upon them, they could expect an unfair outcome. The Black Codes and prejudice courts relegated Black people to something less than a free man. The Reconstruction Acts of 1867 and the Florida Constitution of 1868 overturned the Black Codes. Equal rights for African Americans were written in Florida's Constitution of 1968. It did not ensure that they will always be treated equally. They continued to receive unfair treatment in court, and the labor system did not change. So that was just some of the incidences that were happening during that time as it relates to Florida Black Codes. And to get a full list or to read about Florida Black Codes at that time, you can research Florida Acts and Resolutions 1865 to 1866, and you should be able to get that information. So that was the Florida Black Code. So I just stopped there to talk about what was happening here during that time. So now I'm going to continue leading up to the 14th Amendment. The Black Codes and increasing violence towards African Americans shocked a powerful group of Northern senators and representatives. These congressmen were angered at the efforts to deprive newly freed people of their rights soon after so many Union soldiers had sacrificed their lives to end slavery. Lyman Trumbull from Illinois introduced the Civil Rights Act to the Senate in January 1866. The Senate approved the bill in February, and the House of Representatives voted to pass it in the following month. President Johnson, however, opposed federal protection of the rights of African Americans, and he vetoed the bill. Johnson, who hoped that the Southern states would quickly rejoin the Union, feared the passage of such laws would cause long-standing political tension. Johnson said he preferred that the states handle such questions. Congress required 2/3 majority to override the president's veto. On April 6, the Senate voted 33 to 55 to overturn the veto. On April 9, 3/4 of the House members voted for the act. The act, titled An Act to Protect All Persons in the United States in Their Civil Rights and Furnish the Means of Their Vindication, became the first Civil Rights Act in the United States. It was also the first major law in the U.S. history to be approved over a president's veto. The act granted full rights to all citizens regardless of skin color. It also established the means for law enforcement agencies to enforce the law and for federal courts to try offenders. The Civil Rights Acts of 1866 gave African Americans the rights and privileges of full citizenship. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution, passed in June 1866 and ratified in 1868, further guaranteed the citizenships of African Americans. African Americans would not receive full voting rights, however, until the passage of the 15th Amendment in 1870. Most Southern whites resented the new status of African Americans. Many whites simply could not accept the idea of former enslaved people voting and holding office. As a result, attempts by Southern African Americans to claim their civil rights were met by threats and violence from such groups as the newly formed Ku Klux Klan. The federal government resisted such efforts to deprive African Americans of their rights. In 1867, Congress passed a series of laws called the Reconstruction Acts, which abolished state governments in the South and outlined the process of readmission for the Southern states that still had not rejoined the Union. In 1870 and 1871, Congress passed laws authorizing the use of federal troops to enforce new voting rights laws. So at that time, you had federal troops in the Southern states to be able to enforce all of these laws that protected African Americans. And at that time, you saw where a lot of African Americans were being elected to Congress, also being elected to offices in their states and cities. So I'm just going to read a little blurb about that. The Reconstruction government opens the political process to Southern African Americans. The new governments did more than ban racial discrimination. They also guaranteed African Americans the right to vote and to hold political office. So, but we know that did not last because the Reconstruction Act, the Reconstruction period, I should say, it was from 1865 to 1877. So there was still the Southern states who still opposed these rights. So when we get to 1876, we come to a presidential election, which led to the end of Reconstruction. So I'm going to read about that. So the 1876 presidential election led to the end of Reconstruction. In this election, Rutherford B. Hayes, the candidate for president, his outcome to win depended on disputed returns from the 3 states that still had Reconstruction governments: Florida, Louisiana, South Carolina. A compromise resulted in Hayes' elections as president. The compromise included agreements to withdraw the remaining federal troops out of the South. So he won election, guaranteeing Rutherford Hayes won the presidential election, guaranteeing to the southern states that he would withdraw federal troops out of these southern states for his win. And so he did. So in 1877, he took office when those federal troops left the southern states. That's when you start seeing Jim Crow laws, the black codes, all that, the rights that, not that they were gone as relates to the law, but they were no longer being enforced because African Americans did not have those federal troops there to enforce it. All right. Okay. So I'm almost finished. All right. So the Fourth Amendment continues to provide the basis of civil rights claims in the United States. An example would be Plessy versus Ferguson. And that was in 1896. The court ruled that racially segregated public facilities did not violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, a decision that would help establish the infamous Jim Crow laws throughout the South for decades. But then in 1954, you have the ruling in Brown versus Board of Education, where the Supreme Court overturned the separate but equal doctrine established by Plessy versus Ferguson, ruling that segregated public schools did in fact violate the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And then you also have other cases that use the 14th Amendment and deciding a case, which was Roe versus Wade, which was involving abortions. You also had Loving versus Virginia, which at the time in Virginia, a black person and a white person could not marry. So that the 14th Amendment was used in deciding that case as well. Okay, so that concludes my segment as relates to the 14th Amendment. But for more information about about what I read, you can go to loc.gov, which is the Library of Congress, the worldbookonline.com, and also, again, if you want to read more about Florida Black codes, you can you would research, you could look up the Acts and Resolutions 1865, 1866 for the Black codes. And also the Florida Historical Quarterly, if you also want to read about the article on Florida Black codes. So that concludes my segment. Tomorrow is Jeopardy Noir at 2 p.m. And I will see you next week. Thank you.